All right, welcome back to the shop. It's still Monday, February 17, President's Day, and this is going to be the start of episode 3, and we're going to be talking about fuel systems. We bought Concordia in 2002 from Maxine and Dwight Isabel. The Isabels had just finished a 17-year circumnavigation, 59,000 miles, went across the Atlantic 3 times. I guess they didn't get enough of England. And so when we bought the boat in Port Angeles, Washington, there was a lot of deferred maintenance. And one of the things that we found during the survey was the port fuel tank had corroded through, and the top of the flange had corroded through. And so because we were having the engine out also at that time, it made an ideal time to go ahead and pull that tank and replace it. It was around a 70-gallon tank, and because it was built in place before the decks were put in, we couldn't put in just another single tank, and the shipwright had to make 2 tanks to put into the space that one used to live. So now we have 2 tanks there that I believe are about 33 gallons apiece. In total, we have about 92 gallons of fuel on the ship, separated by 3 tanks. One of the things that I wasn't happy about with the shipwright is that when he reassembled the fuel system, he didn't make any changes to the existing system other than to put another valve on it to accommodate the 3rd tank. And it never really worked right. And so it's annoyed me ever since. On our last trip to the boat, I noticed that one of the existing valves, it's original to the boat, was starting to leak just a little bit, and that, can't have that. So this presented the opportunity to go ahead and change out the fuel system. Wanted to do for quite some time. And ideal world, what I'd love to do, and a lot of people have, is a nice manifold system where you have a billet of aluminum or pipe with a series of valves on it. When I priced it all out, each of those valves are pretty expensive, individually, like 25 to 35 bucks a piece. And in a valve system with 3 tanks, I think that added up to somewhere around 16 valves. And the price, you start adding in the manifold itself, the price was climbing up there pretty rapidly. And that kind of goes back to the wisdom of keep it simple, and sometimes you do things that are on the cheap side. That are durable. The fuel valves we have on the boat have been there since 1978, and now they're just starting to develop a problem. And this is the style that's on the boat right now. This is a Moeller marine product little gate valve. There's 2 styles that we have going to have on board. There's a 3-way valve and then a 2-way valve. And the way these work is you have this little dial on top, and you essentially just turn it to point at your fuel source. And they're pretty simple, actually, and surprisingly very durable. I'm sure if I just unthreaded the top here, I could probably repair the one that's leaking right now, but then I have the system I don't like. So what we're going to do is I'm going to incorporate in a fuel polishing system. I've been wanting one on board because I've had repeated issues with sedimentation in the tank, even though we keep it full and always put algaecide inside the fuel before we leave, and we do that while the boat's still moving, agitated, because you just don't pour it in there when the boat's still. So the way the system's going to work is all the existing fuel delivery will come down in this common area right now, which is essentially really low on the boat, right in front of the flywheel. And all of our fuel sources will then converge into there. Right now, the starboard tank comes in there, and then another single line comes in from the port tanks, which have another valve upstream of it to collect from either tanks. And from that point, it's going to come up into an algae treatment setup, which is this AXI LGX200 algae X fuel conditioner treatment. This allegedly uses magnetics to break up the cells of algae as it comes through the system, and so it prevents its growth. I really don't know how these are going to work or how well they're going to work, but seems like a worthwhile to go ahead and give it a shot and see what happens. So this is since this is passive and it doesn't actually affect the flow, I'm going to have this treat all the fuel before it comes into the engine. This will come in right after the supply site. And then when I want to do the polishing setup, I'll have another two-way valve that will divert it into this guy. So this is a Parker Racor Fuel Polisher model P510MAM, and this has a small pump right at the top, and that's a 60 gallon per hour pump, so obviously it's not going to move fuel through very quickly, but it's going to be working in a pinch when the tanks are pretty low. And one of the things I like about this is a nice sturdy case. The filter element's not too bad. Some of the fuel polisher systems I've seen are actually, obviously a lot bigger than that, but for I think those are around $350. Not a bad setup. When I got the box home, the thing I didn't know and I didn't see in the description is that this bottom wire here is for a water sensor, or water alarm. Probably don't need it, but I went ahead and bought the alarm anyways. It's always good to have some redundant systems. So the way the fuel polisher is going to work is it'll be a two-stage system. This is, I believe, a 10 micron filter here, and what I'm going to have is a third Racor on the boat. I'm going to repurpose that as part of the fuel polishing system, and it'll be downstream of the fuel polisher. And so it'll go from 10 to a 3. That Racor will also, has the bowl so I can see any water in the system, which is why this is kind of redundant. And then it'll go back into another valve like this, and it'll be able to return it to whichever tank that I want. That setup should be pretty simple and pretty bomb-proof, I think. So what this setup's going to be, this build is going to be more of an assembly. I'm going to take a piece of scrap particle board that I have here in the shop, and I'm going to use that to lay out the fuel system. All right, so this is how the fuel system is laid out in the boat, and my plan and how it's going to go in. Now this is set up to where, assuming that all the fuel right now is coming off of the starboard tank. And here's where the system comes in. Down here in the lower right hand side, this is the incoming fuel. This is the starboard tank, this is the port forward tank, this is the port aft tank. Wherever these little dials are pointing, that's the flow direction. So from here it's going to go into the algea, and then it'll hit a 90-degree elbow, come into this selector, which gives the option of either continue it onto the engine or over to the fuel polisher. Once it hits this elbow, then it goes to either of the Racor filters. We'll call this number 1, this one number 2. So the fuel would come in through number 2, hit the Racors, then hit this incoming line, and then it would come out the bottom. Down here there's a T-fitting where it has two supplies. One goes to the Eberspacher water heater that's in the aft stateroom that keeps all of our water hot and also warms the cabin. And then over here is where would be the supply side to the engine. Goes through the engine, and in return hits this fuel selector and then back into the starboard tank. To switch this into a polishing setup, all I'd have to do is switch this valve to polish and this valve to polish. Then, obviously the engine's not running at this point. Fuel polisher's turned on. All the fuel that comes in and out gets cycled in through the starboard tank. If I want to change and transfer fuel from any one tank to another, I would just change it up here and down here. Now, if everything goes to plan, this will be how it's set up. If things go sideways, the only thing I need to change in the system and my layout is essentially not install this or this. Everything else stays the same because these are all existing styles, and the only one that I'm really introducing into the system is this guy and this guy. Those are the only two that are not currently on the boat, and this will get me what I need, is the ability to easily select from the 3 tanks and have the return clean and consistent. Now, one thing to just mention right now, that some of you that have been long-term cruisers are probably saying, well, why don't you have a day tank? Why do you just have 3 30-ish gallon tanks on board? And for those that don't know what a day tank is, those are essentially what it sounds like. You'll take fuel that you trust and you put it into one of your tanks, this day tank, and you just draw off of that, so that if during the day something happens to your fuel, gets contaminated, or you pump, gets some fuel from a questionable source, you have something that the engine will use. Well, Maxine and Dwight, when they had the boat and circumnavigated many countries, they did it with 2 tanks, and they didn't have a day tank. And obviously they didn't have any problems. Dwight never mentioned any to me. And I think the day tank, to me, should be a thing of the past. Especially if you're sailing to most of the common ports of the world. Fuel is very readily available. It's not as hard to get. I think you obviously will if you have any issues. If you're sailing in some really remote areas of the world. But even when we've been down in Mexico getting fuel off of a tender that's going around Turtle Bay, and it's just drawn out a bunch of different tanks, there wasn't any problem with that fuel. It all came from the same source, the Pemex station. So it's not as hard to get good quality diesel today than it would have been, say, 30, 40 years ago, when things were pretty bad and you had to have a Baja filter on your boat. And I have one of those that Dwight gave me. You can't buy the elements for it anymore. They don't make it anymore because, well, fuel's not as hard of an issue anymore. So that's my opinion. I'm sure you have your own. If you do, go ahead and share it. It'll be interesting to hear from folks. And with that, we'll start this assembly. Thanks.
Rough and heavy, steady flow. The rock stopped me for a moment, but I weave above and bend below. I eat what is fed me. I can cause a deadly blow. And still the river flows. Only heaven knows where the 2 is flow, where the rivers flow. I don't know when enough's enough. Over the mountains to the heavens, I follow the current of the river's flow. Of the river's flow. Here we go now, eat the river. Now we know we gotta eat the flow. Here we go now, eat the moment when you toss and turn below. Here we go now, eat the current. The river shines with the dangerous glow. Still the river flows. Only heaven knows where the 2 is flow. Where the rivers flow. Where the rivers flow. Up from the spring down to the rain. No matter what, I will still remain.